Hello. We thought we understood each other completely. Until one summer night by the lake, everything changed and there was no going back. The lake house stood silent against the backdrop of the setting sun, its old wooden porch bathed in the warm amber light of early evening. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the scent of pine and aged timber. Miles Whitaker sat curled up in the armchair by the window, a worn paperback resting against his chest, its words forgotten as his mind drifted elsewhere. Across the room, Rowan Ellis stretched out on the sofa, one arm thrown casually over his eyes as he dozed lightly, the soft sound of his breathing blending with the whisper of the wind outside. It had always been this way between them, an easy, comforting silence that spoke louder than words ever could. Summers spent at the lake house had become a tradition, a quiet refuge from the rush of their separate lives. There were no schedules, no demands, just the simple companionship of two people who understood each other without needing to explain themselves. Yet, this summer, the silence felt heavier, as if something unspoken hung between them, shifting in the stillness of the evening air. Miles watched the light play across the room, casting long, soft shadows on the worn floorboards. He tried to lose himself in the familiar comfort of the moment, but his thoughts kept circling back to Rowan. There was something different about him this year, something Miles couldn't quite name. A glance held a second too long, a touch that lingered past casual familiarity. The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they stirred something restless inside him. He shifted in his chair, feeling the old wood creak beneath him. His gaze flickered to Rowan, taking in the relaxed line of his body, the way the fading light softened the edges of his features. Miles's chest tightened inexplicably, and he quickly looked away, guilt prickling at the edges of his thoughts. This was Rowan, his closest friend, the person who knew him better than anyone else. Whatever strange feelings were creeping in, they had no place here. Outside, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, and the room dimmed, taking on a cooler, deeper shade of blue. Miles stood and moved quietly to the small kitchen, busying himself with making tea, hoping the simple ritual would steady him. He filled the kettle and set it on the stove, listening to the growing hum of the water heating. As he waited, his mind wandered again. He thought about the years they had spent together, the easy laughter, the late-night talks under the stars, the way Rowan had always been a constant in his life. It should have been enough. It had always been enough. And yet now, with the house cloaked in evening stillness and the weight of unsaid things pressing against the walls, Miles found himself longing for something he didn't fully understand. The kettle whistled softly, and Miles poured the steaming water into 2 mugs, setting them carefully on the counter. He hesitated for a moment, then carried them back into the living room. Rowan stirred as the scent of tea filled the air, lifting his arm from his eyes and offering Miles a sleepy, grateful smile. Miles's heart stuttered at the simple, unconscious gesture. They sat together without speaking, the mugs warming their hands as night fully descended outside. The soft croak of frogs by the lake and the distant rustle of trees provided a gentle soundtrack to their silence. Miles sipped his tea, stealing occasional glances at Rowan, noting the way the dim light caught the curve of his jaw, the steady rise and fall of his chest. There was a peace to it, and yet also an ache, a gnawing sense that something was changing, something neither of them dared to name. Miles wondered if Rowan felt it too, or if it was just his own heart betraying him, weaving stories out of the quiet moments. The evening wore on, and eventually Rowan stretched and stood, mumbling something about turning in for the night. Miles nodded, offering a faint smile, though inside he felt a pang of reluctance. He watched as Rowan disappeared down the hall, the soft sound of his footsteps fading into the hush of the house. Left alone, Miles remained seated, staring into the darkness. The room felt too large now, too empty. He wrapped his arms around himself, seeking comfort against the swell of emotions he couldn't quite name. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that this summer would not end the way the others had. Something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old windows gently, as if whispering secrets meant only for the night to hear. Miles closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the house surround him, trying to find his way back to the calm he had always found here. But the peace was elusive now, slipping through his fingers like smoke. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another day of pretending that everything was the same. For tonight, though, Miles allowed himself to sit in the quiet, to acknowledge the ache blooming quietly in his chest. It was frightening, exhilarating, and deeply unfamiliar. But somehow, in the depth of that stillness, he knew nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains, casting soft beams across the living room. Miles awoke to the faint sounds of birdsong and the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore. The house felt different somehow, as if the walls themselves were aware of the shifting tides between its inhabitants. Stretching stiffly, he rose from the armchair where he had fallen asleep and made his way to the kitchen. Rowan was already there, standing by the window, staring out at the lake with a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, but there was a certain tension to the set of his shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. Miles hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to announce his presence or simply observe. Choosing the former, he cleared his throat softly and crossed to the counter. Rowan glanced over his shoulder, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, but no words. Miles busied himself making his own cup of coffee, the familiar ritual offering a fragile sense of normalcy. They sat at the small kitchen table, sipping their drinks in silence. The quiet between them, once easy and comfortable, now pulsed with unspoken thoughts and restless energy. Miles found himself hyper-aware of every movement Rowan made, every shift in his seat, every brush of his fingers against the rim of his mug. After breakfast, they retreated to their usual activities. Rowan grabbed a book and stretched out on the porch, while Miles wandered down to the dock with a sketch pad. The morning wore on, the sun climbing higher into the sky, but the tension between them never fully dissipated. It lingered, a silent presence neither could shake. Miles tried to focus on his sketching, letting the steady rhythm of pencil on paper anchor him. He drew the outline of the trees lining the far side of the lake, the way their reflections shimmered in the water. But no matter how hard he tried, his eyes kept drifting back to the house, to the figure reclining on the porch, lost in thought. It wasn't just the way Rowan looked that drew Mila's attention, though that was certainly part of it. It was something deeper, something in the way he existed in the world, so effortlessly and yet so completely. Miles had always admired that about him, but now that admiration felt dangerously close to something more. By midday, the heat drove them both back inside. They lounged in the living room, each pretending to be absorbed in their own distractions. The fan hummed in the corner, stirring the heavy air, but it did little to ease the weight pressing down on them. Miles caught Rowan watching him once, their eyes meeting for a brief, electric moment before Rowan quickly looked away. The air between them seemed to crackle with the intensity of that fleeting connection. Mila's heart thudded in his chest, and he forced himself to focus on the book in his lap, though he couldn't remember a single word he read. The day slipped by in a haze of unspoken tension. Evening fell, bringing cooler air and a sky awash with stars. After a quiet dinner, they found themselves back on the porch, each nursing a glass of lemonade. The lake was a mirror of the night sky, perfectly still and infinite. They sat side by side, close enough that their elbows occasionally brushed. Each accidental touch sent a jolt through Miles, setting his nerves alight. He wondered if Rowan felt it too, if the silence between them was filled with the same desperate longing that coiled in his own chest. Miles tilted his head back, gazing up at the stars. The vastness of the universe stretched out above him, a reminder of how small and fragile they were. And yet, sitting there beside Rowan, he felt a sense of gravity stronger than anything had ever known, pulling him inexorably towards something he didn't fully understand. The night deepened around them, the cool breeze carrying the scent of water and pine. Miles wanted to speak, to break the tension, to find the right words that would somehow make sense of the storm brewing inside him. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat in the silence, feeling the warmth of Rowan's presence beside him, and wondered how much longer they could pretend that nothing had changed. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, as two hearts beat in quiet, restless synchrony, each yearning for something just out of reach. The following morning arrived with a misty veil hanging low over the lake, the world outside looking blurred and dreamlike. Miles awoke earlier than usual, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing down on his chest. He sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing sleep from his eyes, trying to shake off the strange, restless energy that seemed to have settled into his very bones. The house was quiet, too quiet. He padded down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug. The living room was empty, the kitchen abandoned, a half-finished cup of coffee still sitting on the table. He found Rowan out by the dock, sitting cross-legged with his back to the house, staring out over the still water. His figure was a dark silhouette against the soft gray of the morning. Miles stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him. There was something heartbreakingly solitary about Rowan's posture, something that tugged painfully at Mila's chest. He knew he couldn't keep pretending. The silence between them was becoming unbearable, stretching taut like a thread ready to snap. Taking a deep breath, Miles stepped outside, the cool air biting gently at his skin. He crossed the yard slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. As he neared the dock, Rowan turned his head slightly, acknowledging his presence but saying nothing. Miles lowered himself down beside him, careful to leave a respectful distance between them, though every part of him ached to move closer. They sat in silence, watching the mist swirl over the lake. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing down to just the two of them and the unspoken words hanging in the air. Miles wanted to speak, to find the right thing to say that would bridge the growing chasm between them. But his mouth felt dry, and the words stuck stubbornly in his throat. Instead, he glanced sideways at Rowan, taking in the tension in his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted restlessly in his lap. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. They had spent countless summers here, sharing jokes and stories, laughter echoing across the water. But now, even breathing the same air felt fraught with tension, each of them tiptoeing around an invisible boundary they both knew was there, but neither dared to cross. A breeze stirred the surface of the lake, sending ripples cascading outward. Miles watched them, mesmerized by the way they disturbed the perfect stillness, just as their own feelings were disturbing the carefully maintained peace between them. Finally, Rowan shifted, drawing his knees up to his chest and wrapping his arms around them. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, rough with something that sounded suspiciously like fear. "Do you ever think about what would happen if things changed?" he asked, not looking at Miles. The question hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Mila's heart clenched painfully. He swallowed hard, staring out over the water as he struggled to find his voice. All the time, he admitted, the words feeling like a release, a crack in the dam he had built inside himself. Rowan said nothing, but his body seemed to sag with relief, as if Mila's confession had lifted a weight from his shoulders. They sat there for what felt like hours, neither speaking, both lost in the fragile, trembling space between fear and hope. The mist began to lift, revealing the sparkling surface of the lake. The sun broke through the clouds in scattered beams, casting golden light across the water. It felt like a sign, a small, tentative promise of clarity after so much confusion. Miles turned his head slightly, daring to look at Rowan. His friend's profile was bathed in sunlight, every line and curve achingly familiar, and yet somehow brand new. There was a softness in his expression, a kind of tentative openness that made Mila's chest ache. Without thinking, Miles reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Rowan's. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was enough. Rowan didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, their fingers grazing in a silent, uncertain dance. Neither spoke. There was no need. The gesture said everything their words couldn't. It was a beginning, a silent acknowledgement of the feelings they had both tried so hard to deny. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, the mist burned away by the growing warmth of the day. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Miles allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through the uncertainty together. The weight of unspoken words still lingered, but it was no longer crushing. It was simply part of the new reality they were both learning to navigate, one tentative, trembling step at a time. The evening settled over the lake with a hushed reverence, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Miles sat on the front steps of the lake house, arms wrapped loosely around his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last sliver of sunlight faded into deep indigo. The sky above blossomed with stars, scattering light across the dark canvas of night. Behind him, the house glowed softly with the light of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Somewhere inside, Rowan moved quietly, his footsteps a faint whisper against the wood. Miles listened without turning, his heart beating a steady rhythm of anticipation and uncertainty. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Miles welcomed the slight chill against his skin, grateful for anything that grounded him in the moment. He knew Rowan would join him soon. It had become a silent ritual between them over the past few days, this sitting together under the stars, saying nothing, yet speaking volumes. When Rowan finally emerged, he didn't say a word. He simply lowered himself onto the steps beside Miles, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. They sat like that for a long time, both staring out into the endless night, the silence between them fragile and electric. Miles stole a glance at Rowan, taking in the tense line of his jaw, the way his hands fidgeted slightly in his lap. He recognized the same nervous energy that coursed through his own veins, the same desperate need to break the dam that held back everything they had left unsaid. The stars seemed impossibly bright, their light shimmering across the surface of the lake. Miles tilted his head back, letting the vastness of the universe wash over him, a reminder of how small and fleeting their lives were against such infinity. And yet, somehow, the moment felt monumental, as if the entire cosmos had narrowed down to this one point in time, to the space between him and Rowan. The words had been building inside him for days, clawing at the walls of his chest, begging for release. He didn't know if he had the courage to give them voice, but he knew he couldn't keep carrying them alone. The weight was too much. "I've been scared," he said finally, his voice barely more than a breath against the night. Rowan turned slightly, his body tense but attentive. Miles kept his eyes fixed on the stars, afraid that if he looked directly at Rowan, he would lose his nerve. "Scared of ruining this," Miles continued, the words spilling out in a quiet rush. "Of losing you." The confession hung between them, raw and vulnerable. Miles felt exposed, stripped bare by the honesty he had held back for so long. He waited, heart pounding, for Rowan to say something. Anything. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, with a soft exhale, Rowan spoke. "Me too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than you know." Miles dared to turn his head, meeting Rowan's eyes in the dim light. What he saw there took his breath away, not fear, not hesitation, but a reflection of his own feelings, the same aching longing, the same desperate hope. Slowly, cautiously, Rowan reached out, his hand finding Milas where it rested on his knee. His touch was light, tentative, as if asking permission. Miles didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, their fingers intertwining in a simple, unspoken answer. They sat like that, hands joined, as the night deepened around them. No more words were needed. The connection between them had been acknowledged, fragile but real, and it bound them together in a way that defied explanation. The lake shimmered under the starlight, a perfect mirror to the sky above. Miles felt a sense of peace settle over him, a quiet certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. The fear hadn't disappeared, but it had been joined by something stronger, hope. The world around them faded into the background, leaving only the steady rhythm of their breathing, the warmth of their joined hands, and the infinite expanse of stars above, bearing silent witness to the beginning of something beautiful and unknown. The first light of dawn crept silently across the sky, painting the world in soft hues of gold and pink. Inside the lake house, Miles lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of Rowan's breathing from the other side of the room. Sleep had eluded him, replaced by a quiet, fragile hope that filled the spaces where fear once resided. The memory of the previous night lingered in his mind, vivid and undeniable. The way their fingers had intertwined, the way the silence between them had shifted from unbearable to comforting, filled with understanding rather than uncertainty. They had crossed a threshold, one that could never be undone, and yet, instead of fear, Miles felt something close to peace. He turned his head slightly, allowing his gaze to rest on Rowan. The early light illuminated his features, casting soft shadows across his face. Miles found himself marveling at how familiar and yet how new Rowan looked in this moment, as if he were seeing him for the first time, stripped of all the walls they had both built around themselves. Careful not to disturb the stillness, Miles slipped out of bed and padded quietly into the kitchen. The house was cool and silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. He moved through the familiar motions of making coffee, finding comfort in the simple ritual. When he returned to the living room, 2 steaming mugs in hand, Rowan was awake, sitting up and rubbing sleep from his eyes. Their gazes met across the room, and for a moment, neither spoke. But there was no awkwardness, no need to fill the space with hurried words. Instead, Miles offered a small, tentative smile, and Rowan returned it, slow and genuine. They sat together on the couch, sipping their coffee, the morning light gradually filling the room with warmth. The silence between them was different now, not heavy, but full of quiet possibility. Miles could feel the shift, the subtle realignment of everything they had once taken for granted. Later, they ventured outside, drawn by the soft pull of a new day. The lake was a perfect mirror, reflecting the endless expanse of sky above. They walked side by side along the shoreline, their steps in easy rhythm, the occasional brush of their hands sending shivers of awareness through Miles. Words came easier now, small and steady. They spoke of inconsequential things, the weather, the plans for the day, the way the trees were beginning to turn with the first hints of autumn. Beneath the surface, though, ran a deeper current, a shared understanding that made every glance, every touch, resonate with meaning. At the end of the path, they paused, looking out over the water. The sun had risen fully now, casting a brilliant glow across the landscape. Miles felt Rowan's gaze on him and turned to meet it, finding a reflection of his own emotions in those familiar eyes. Without thinking, Miles reached out, his hand finding Rowan's with a certainty that surprised even him. Their fingers laced together naturally, effortlessly, as if this was where they had always belonged. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, letting the world fall away until there was nothing left but the warmth of the sun on their skin and the steady, reassuring presence of each other. In that moment, Miles realized that new beginnings often arrived not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with small, quiet choices. A look, a touch, a willingness to step into the unknown. The future stretched out before them, uncertain and uncharted, but no longer frightening. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, one day at a time. As the morning breeze stirred the surface of the lake, carrying with it the scent of water and pine, Miles squeezed Rowan's hand gently, a silent promise that no matter where life took them, they would always have this moment, this connection, this beginning. They turned together and began the slow walk back to the house, their steps light, their hearts full, the path ahead open and waiting. Goodbye.